In this video, we are going to learn about custom hooks. Custom hooks is a concept in React where in functional components we can have reusable logic that is also stateful. But before we go there, let's take an example which I think we took also in one of the earlier videos, where what we are trying to do is that there is a state variable count and we are setting up an interval so that that count value is getting incremented by 1 every second. So if we use something like this, then we'll see that yeah, so this works, but if you pay attention, then at the initial point from 0, it directly starts from 2 because we are currently in dev mode, and when the first time two renders happens, then basically this set interval starts with two set intervals, because that is not cleaned up, right? We need to do cleanup, and that's why we need to return a cleanup function also from the use effect. However, there is one other problem also, that if we don't use this function style of set count, rather we simply use count plus 1, then we will see that it will always be stuck at 1. After 1 it is not going ahead because this count variable is now captured, and the first time at mount this effect is created where the count value is 0, and essentially after every second, though this function is called, but essentially every time it is setting 0 plus 1 0 plus 1 0 plus 1, which means that every time it is just setting 1, and that's why even though after every 1 second that function is called, it is still remaining 1 only. So both of the problems can be solved if we use our cleanup function where we clear the interval. How we clear interval? This set interval returns us some id, let's call it interval id. We'll take this interval id and we'll return a function where this interval id will be called with clear interval, and which will essentially solve both of the problems. Though we also need to use count so that this effect is run and recreated every time this count is changing. And why that is important? Because every time count is changing, we need to have a new effect with the new captured value of count, and as soon as the new effect is scheduled to be run, before that the previous effects cleanup function, this return function, will be already called, and we know that in this fashion we will be able to get that counter perfectly. Okay, so now that it is working, our intention is to have a reusable version of this. A reusable version of this, which means that we can take this logic, and let's say in some other component also we need exactly this sort of counter, then we can use the same shared logic at that place only. So what we will do is that we will copy this function and create a new function, and we will call it use counter, and that function will essentially contain that logic. At the end we are going to return the count value, and we can use this reusable logic here like this. Okay, so firstly let's see whether it works or not. So save it, refresh, and we see that it works exactly like that. So how does this work? First of all, we can see that the whole logic of stateful counter is moved to another function. Okay, now there are two things to note about this function. The first is that this function name starts with use, and the second is that this function also contains some other hooks. In this case it contains sets, use state, it contains use effect. So essentially this is the definition of a custom hook. In this case, use counter is a custom hook. What is a custom hook? A custom hook is a function, is just a plain JavaScript function whose name starts with use, and it can also contain other hooks inside this. In fact, a custom hook can also contain other custom hooks. But in this case, we are just having two inbuilt hooks used inside this custom hook. Once we have the custom hook, then we can use it simply in any component like this. Okay. Now, first thing is that this custom hook can be used in any place wherever we want. Okay. And this piece of code, this custom hook, is generally important because this has some shared logic, and more importantly it has some stateful shared logic. If you pay attention, then this variable which is returned by this custom hook is stateful, which means that this function just renders count. But more importantly, if this would have been simply 50, let's say, if it would be simply 50, then this component will simply render 50 as it is, static value, right? But instead of this, if we use counter hook, then this count variable is now stateful, and when this changes, how the new values are given, that is completely decided by this custom hook. And as a matter of fact, we will get a value which is stateful, stateful means it can change over time, and the state is internal to this particular hook. We don't need to care about that. Okay, this can be used at multiple places in multiple components. In fact, in a single component also it can be used multiple times. Okay, so something like count 1, count 2, and you can have count 1, count 2, something like this. Okay, and right now both are starting with 0, that's why they're in sync. But you can very well understand that, yeah, that is because everything is starting from 0. We can give it a custom value. So let's say it starts with this value which is given as an argument, and now this value you can pass. So let's say this starts with 10 and this starts with 15. Okay, so here this first counter will start with 10 and the second counter with 15, and you can see that from there the counting starts every second. So the important point to note is that though custom hooks have stateful logic, which means that they share the stateful logic, the stateful piece of code, which can have state also inside it, though the state is not shared. So you can understand that even though the code is same, the actual state given by this and this is completely different, which means that corresponding to each custom hook, the maintained state is completely different, and they are being tracked and modified completely separately. So the stateful logic is shared, but actual state is being given different every time you use a custom hook. Let's take some another example of custom hook. So now that we know that a particular custom hook can give a stateful value, let's try to do something. Let's try to see that if a particular value is passed, starting from 0 till that value should be changed within 1 second. Okay, so the value will start from 0, and whatever argument you pass, it will become that value within 1 second. That is our requirement. So let's change the name. Let's name it, let's say, use dynamic value, which means that it will give a dynamic value till this, and the whole thing will change within 1 second. So let's name it value This is no more needed. And now inside the hook, what we are going to do is that, yeah, so let's keep the name count only, but the value will be initially started with 0, and our purpose is that we have to reach from 0 to value within 1 second. Okay, so let's say we have to do this in 10 parts. 10 parts, okay, which means in 10 times we have to do. So what we will do, we will do that in 100 milliseconds. We have to do we have to keep on doing this thing, so that, let's say, what is the difference, the so if in 1 second we have to do something, then every 100 millisecond we have to do 1/10 of that, right? So our whole delta, let's say d, that is going to be value divided by 10. If we do that, then we'll have d delta, and every time we will increment this by d. So initially it will be 0, and let's say it is 10, right? So it will become 1 after 100 millisecond, it will become 2 after 200 millisecond, and this value will be reached after 1 second. Okay, but once that once that particular value is reached, then after that we don't want to further keep on doing this set count, right? So for that, what we can do is that we can have a condition that, let's say, initially this will be, let's say, null, right? And then we will do something like this: interval id is equal to this, we will do, but here we will have a condition that if interval id is there, then only we are going to do clear interval, otherwise nothing to do, right? Which means that even if cleanup function is called, and if this interval id is null, then we are not going to do anything. But the more important point is that here, when the count value, this value, is strictly less than that particular value, till that time only we have to do this thing, right? So essentially we will have a condition that if this count till the time the count is less than value, till that time only we are going to do this. Okay, and now we have a effect where this thing is changing. Okay, so if we see save, and we'll see that in 1 second this value is changed to 10, and now it is changing in 1 second with 10 parts, right? But that parts also, that that how many times it is happening, that also you can customize, right? So for example, let's say you say that no, it should not be 10, it should be, let's say, 100 parts. If you do that, then rather than value by 10, you have to every time increment it every time by amount value by n, so that 100th part of value is incremented every time, and how many and each duration will be also 1 second divided by n. Okay, so this will also work. So you can see now that the value is changing to almost 10 as soon as we keep on doing this. Okay, so slight rounding might be needed, but then you get the idea, right? That you can even return this thing in close approximation of uh, approximation of let's say integral approximation of 100 of integral approximation in the range of wherever. So let's say you want till first decimal or till second decimal, those values you can return, right? But now essentially we are getting the idea that whether we need 10, whether we need 20, whatever the things we need, the idea is that it will go to that value, in 1 second, right? Now again you can customize this also. Let's say we are saying that we also pass a duration, and then duration is something which you use, and then here you can pass duration also. So let's say you want to change it in 1000, or let's say you don't pass anything, then by default it is 1000. However, so you can see that right now by default it is like in 1 second it is done, but you pass let's say 2000 millisecond, then the whole thing will be changed in 2000 in 2 seconds. So now you can see that in 2 seconds it is reaching out to 10. Anyways, now we have got a dynamic value, right? Now we can use that in any way what we want. So for example, let's say instead of directly printing it like this, we have simply let's say simply empty div, just having a single space or something. And what we can do is that this empty div is having a style component, and actually in JSX you can write style like this, where each of the style attributes can be given like an object. Okay, which means that here you can give whatever in CSS you used to give, just that here the things will be camel case, which means that rather than font size, which is in CSS, here you have to use something like font size. Other than that, most of the things is, so here you can do 10 pixel or something like that. But here we are going to set the width, right? So width is, let's say so width is going to be our value. So how do we do that? It will be by default initially it will be 0, and then it will go till 10. Okay, so let's do that. Let's make that value from 0 to, rather than 0 to 10, let's make that till 100. So from 0 pixel to 100 pixel we have to do, right? So we can do something like this. Okay, so this value will be 0 to 100. Okay, so this width will go from 0 pixel to 100 pixel, and let's use a background color. So some background color we can give, and that background color can be, let's say, blue. Now you can see that it is changing to 100 pixel in 2 seconds. You can change it to 1 second. In that case you can see that value is changing to 1 second. And again you can have multiple values at one time. Okay, so let's say this is 100, this is 200, and this is, let's say, half second only. Okay, and then you can have this value 1, this value 2, and then you can have a multiple like this. This is value 1, this is value 2, and this is blue, this is pink. Okay, so in that manner anything you can do. Now you can understand that this second one is in half second, and this first one is in 1 second. Okay, so these sort of things. And again the thing which you are seeing is that it is looking like discrete. That can be much smoother if you make it like somewhat more, for example, somewhat more parts. So let's say instead of 20 parts, let's say you have 50 parts, like okay, then what will happen, that every time it will be slightly more smoother. So you can see that now the behavior is more smoother rather than discrete. Okay, so basically you can understand the idea is that using just a particular hook, now rather than getting a constant value, you can get a stateful value. That is the whole point of having a hook. Hook can give you a reusable piece of stateful logic where each time you call it, a separate stateful instance will be created, and that stateful value you can use it. Now these are some of the complicated examples, right, where we are using a cleanup function also. There can be simpler examples where there is no cleanup function, just some logic is there here, and then there is no cleanup function, nothing is written, no function is written, right? And even simply a simple some use effect is there, and that should be also sufficient for creating a custom hook. Now the point is that we in one of the earlier videos we also saw an example of like use previous, where let's say some value, whether it is a state or prop, its previous value was being used, right? You remember using use ref, we created that, right? That was also an example of custom hook. One another example can be like you cannot call API requests directly here. You need to have a use effect, and inside that use effect you need to do whatever async await, you have some URL fetch the data, right? Again, that since that thing is done inside a use effect, again that thing can be moved in some a custom hook, and here you can simply have something like use URL data, or use server data, or something, some like that, some hook can be there, and in that you just pass URL and get the value. Okay, and why that is needed, that is a hook instead of a normal function, because you cannot simply have an async function directly here inside a inside a functional component, because they involve asynchronous things, and they should be done in some effects, right? Whether it is like component did mount, or even on some update value updates, but they must be done in some effects, and that's why they can also be moved to some reusable, that sort of the whole reusable thing can be moved into a function, and but that function will eventually be a hook because it is using another effect. Okay, so in that fashion we can create a bunch of examples, but right now you can understand that this sort of things can be fairly easily done. So right now we saw a few examples. We can come up with some new examples also, and we'll see that there are a few more interesting examples of custom hooks which can be useful in daily use cases of React, creating React components, that we might see in some other video. So for now, in this video, I think you have a good idea about the what are custom hooks in React and how to create them for yourself. So that would be all for this video. Thanks a lot.